everyone, and thank you for attending today's webcast, Blasting Safety with 10X Abrasives. My name is Stephanie Chiswick, and I'm Editor-in-Chief for Coatings Pro Magazine. In this webcast, you will learn about the history and composition of the 10X superoxalloy raw material, the toxicological testing in the lab and on living subjects, and documented issues and challenges with air sampling and their implications for quantifying exposures in abrasive blasting. Before we begin, we wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience console are multiple application widgets you can use. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can click on the Q&A widget at the bottom and submit your question. The presenters will answer as many questions as they can at the end of the webcast and will respond to all remaining questions via email. We do capture all questions. You can expand your slide area by clicking on the maximize icon on the top right of the slide area or by dragging the bottom right corner of the slide area. If you have any technical difficulties, please click on the help widget. It has a question mark icon and covers common technical issues. An on-demand version of the webcast will be available in about 24 hours and can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Without further delay, I'd like to introduce our presenters, Dr. Stephen Ritchie, Jacob Valancourt, and Stephen Idris. Dr. Stephen Ritchie is a founder of 10X Engineered Materials and is a former director of Clean Technology Research and Development at Battelle Memorial Institute. He is responsible for research, development, and technology strategy at 10X. Jacob Valancourt is an original founder of 10X Engineered Materials with experience in manufacturing, insurance, and local politics. Jacob is responsible for business development, marketing, and sales for 10X. Stephen Idris is the CEO of 10X Engineered Materials and former general manager at Owens Corning and CEO of Thermofiber Inc. Steve was also an active leader in the North American Insulation Manufacturers Association for 15 years. With that, I will turn the presentation over to Dr. Stephen Ritchie.
Well, thank you, Stephanie, and good afternoon, everybody. As Stephanie said, my name is Steve Ritchie. I'm a co-founder of 10X Engineered Materials. We'll be presenting the safety history of 10X material and the results of the scientific search for the truth over the past year about trace ingredients in our material and the way exposures are measured in blasting. Nothing you'll see or hear today is our opinion. What we're sharing comes from credible third-party sources and peer-reviewed publications. We've learned about some important problems with air sampling during blasting. Some of you may already be aware of. But the goal of this webinar is to raise awareness and hopefully start a productive dialogue about how to address them for the benefit of the blasting industry and its workers. So a little bit about us. 10X was formed by a group of engineers. We spent our careers developing and commercializing clean and efficient technologies. Our values are centered on innovation, developing transformational technologies, and safety and environmental sustainability. 10X abrasives are made from the byproducts of mineral wool, which has been safely produced, installed, used, and discarded for over 100 years. It's used as insulation, soundproofing, fireproofing, and even as a growing media for human food production. Now, because mineral wool is fibrous, and fiber dusts had been shown to be cancerous in humans, it's also among the most toxicologically studied commercial materials in history. What's important to note is that the product and the byproduct, which becomes our abrasive, are identical in every way except form. The product is fibers, the byproduct is particles, but they have the same properties and material composition. Mineral wool, the product mineral wool is produced by simultaneously spinning and rapidly cooling a molten liquid mixture of minerals. The product fibers get blown on for further processing, and the byproduct particles, called shot, fall to the bottom and are often discarded as waste in very high volumes. But this process of rapidly freezing a flowing liquid produces an amorphous and tempered material that is strong, durable, and fracture resistant. And it's this impact strength that gives 10X abrasives the advantages of high working speed, low consumption, low embedment, but as importantly, high visibility for blasters and low dust exposure. As we were developing this technology, we conducted material testing because we knew that compliance with SSPC AB1, CARB, mil-spec were going to be critical for market adoption. The hazardous metals testing for SSPC certification are in the table. They were conducted in per the requirements of California Title 22. We submitted samples to KTA Tater for these analyses, and it shows that the material is remarkably clean. And by the way, initially when we started the company and we went to market, our initial claims of no beryllium were based on these and other test results showing beryllium undetectable in the samples. But in late 2020, 2021, we started hearing positive beryllium results from air monitoring in the field, which we were naturally skeptical of. We now understand why measured concentrations are so high, which is the subject of the second half of this webinar. But last year, we undertook an effort to understand as best we could the true beryllium level in the material. So we sent identical samples to multiple laboratories to be analyzed for beryllium using a variety of analytical methods. And we found that the results vary pretty much on the order of the measurement, depending on which lab and which method was used. And this same variability is likely to be present in the analysis of air samples as well. But the average beryllium content was 5.49 ppm, which is extremely low, but on the high side relative to other abrasives. We updated our SDS last year to reflect the results of this study. To put the safety history of our material in perspective, it's important to provide a general overview of how the toxicity of materials is established. The primary goal of toxicology testing is to develop dose-response relationships that predict the severity of effects of exposure to hazardous substances in humans. The testing to accomplish this involves human and animal studies that directly measure the biological effects of exposure in living subjects. Now, the results from human epidemiological studies are certainly the most relevant, but they also carry disadvantages. They're often small sample group sizes, there isn't much control over dose, and there is difficulty in isolating the effect of the agent being studied. They also take a long time, they're complex, and are costly to perform. Now, animal exposure studies overcome many of these limitations, and they remain the gold standard for toxicology testing. Sample sizes, animal species, dose ranges, and both positive and negative controls can all be carefully selected, and the important effects can be measured directly over time. The limitation of animal testing is that it's not done in humans, but our ability to understand which effects in animals are predictive in humans improves with time. Most, if not all, threshold limit values and permissible exposure limits are established using these kinds of human and animal exposure studies. So how do these results make their way into regulations? Well, the foundation of all of this is the scientific work done in universities, private companies, government institutions. They produce the evidence, and their goal is to develop predictive dose-response relationships in humans. The body of scientific evidence that they generate is reviewed by authoritative organizations around the world. They include the World Health Organization, International Agency for Research on Cancer, U.S. National Toxicology Program under the CDC, and AGCIH. And they evaluate the quality and completeness of the studies and make determinations about whether a material is hazardous or carcinogenic and at what dose or exposure level. Regulating bodies like the EPA and OSHA and the OSHA counterparts in other countries use the work of the scientists and the review bodies to set exposure limits and the requirements for classifying and communicating the hazards of substances. And it's important to appreciate the gravity of human and animal exposure studies and how much weight the determination of review bodies like IARC, NTP, and ACGIH have. For example, when classifying hazards on an SDS for a material mixture, the OSHA Hazard Communication Standard requires that toxicological testing data for the mixture as a whole be used in place of data for individual ingredients for non-carcinogenic substances, if it's available. The toxicological data for a mixture can also be used when classifying for carcinogenicity if conclusive test data for the mixture is available. The standard also states, and this is all in Appendix A, that the conclusions of organizations like IARC and NTP can be considered as having established the carcinogenicity of a substance or mixture. And as we mentioned a little earlier, mineral wool is among the most studied materials, in history. There are decades of what IARC called unusually large and complete human epidemiological studies that did not show excess lung diseases, cancer, or mortality in the exposed groups compared to unexposed groups. There were tens of millions of dollars invested in extensive long-term animal studies to investigate in detail how and why mineral wool does not pose an inhalation risk. And what was learned in all this testing is that mineral wool is biosoluble in lung fluids, and it's able to be quickly cleared, which avoids the chronic effects that lead to lung diseases and cancer. 10X is the only abrasive material that's been directly tested in toxicology studies and has an IARC monograph concluding that it's not classifiable as carcinogenic to humans. And because of this IARC designation, there isn't a regulating body in the world that considers mineral wool a human carcinogen. OSHA regulates mineral wool as a nuisance dust. So Steve Idris, you were there through all of this. I mean, can you add some color on the effect this had in the mineral wool industry?
So I think first off, Steve, you have to go back and look at what is mineral wool. And mineral wool has been effectively produced since the late 1880s. So it's been around 150 years. And it is actually one of the primary types of insulation worldwide. But it's not just used for insulation, it's used also in making your commercial ceiling tile in many of your offices, airports. It's used in fireproofing for high-rise applications, etc. So I spent 30 of my years working directly in the mineral wool industry, and actually 37 years now working in and around the mineral wool industry. And I can say that of the companies globally that I know of, the mineral wool that all of the companies make, they do have specific directives as to what raw materials they're going to melt in order to make the mineral wool, and then also a specific chemistry that they design their mineral wool fibers for. All of those chemistries are designed to be biosoluble. There are directives in each of the regions out there that some of them direct companies, you will only make a biosoluble mineral wool fiber for that very purpose. And yes, I was around NEMA, the Insulation Manufacturers Association, during this time when IARC made their designation and essentially moved it to a class 3, not classifiable. So very well studied product.
Okay, I appreciate that. So this is a very high-level look at some of what was reviewed in the IARC monograph for mineral wool. The human and animal studies were rare in several respects. The number of studies, the size of the sample groups, the quality of the data, and the dose and duration of the exposure studied. The monograph comments on this. It's a very complete data set. The human studies followed the medical records of 26,000 exposed workers around the world over a 50-year period. The standardized mortality ratio is essentially the ratio of negative outcomes in exposed groups to unexposed groups. So an SMR greater than 1 indicates mortality, excess mortality in the exposed group. And in these human studies, it wasn't statistically different from 1. The animal studies involved several species of animals using different methods of exposure. Sometimes they inject dust and fluid into a targeted area, and in other studies, it involves inhalation exposure of animals to a range of dust concentrations. Now, the study being highlighted here is one remarkable example of an inhalation study in rats. Groups of rats were exposed to filtered air as a negative control and 3 different concentrations of respirable mineral wool dust. Respirable dust is the smallest particles that are able to reach the deep gas exchange regions of the lung and are the most hazardous. The 3 doses were 3 milligrams per meter cubed, 16 milligrams per meter cubed, and 30 milligrams per meter cubed. And for reference, the permissible exposure limit for respirable dust is 5 milligrams per meter cubed. Asbestos was also included in the study at a dose of 10 milligrams per meter cubed because it is a known carcinogen at that dose. The exposure to asbestos actually had to be stopped at 10 months because of high mortality in that group. The mineral wool groups were exposed for 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, for 2 years. 2 years is about 80% of the lifespan of an average rat. The results showed no excess lung weight at any point during the study, and that particle counts decreased rapidly when exposure was stopped. And this indicates that the dust was being cleared fast enough not to accumulate over time. The lungs in the exposed groups examined by pathologists were as healthy as rats exposed to filtered air. There were no exposure-related lesions observed in any of the 346 exposed rats over the course of the 2-year study. Laboratory testing in simulated lung fluids revealed that the material actually dissolves and can be cleared from the lungs quickly. Now, we have known all of this all along, and we have never doubted the safety of our material. And what perplexed us when we were hearing people say that there were dangerous levels of toxic material in our abrasive is how could it have shown no harm in all of this testing if it contained dangerously high levels of toxic substances like beryllium? I mean, you would think the effects would surface at some point over 70 years of studies. So, are abrasives with the lowest beryllium content the safest? The next question that comes to mind is, are there any published toxicological testing data for other abrasives? Well, it turns out that the toxicological data available for abrasive materials is limited. NIOSH and others acknowledge this. But there are 3 animal studies of abrasives over the past 20 years or so, 2 short-term installation exposure studies by NIOSH in 2001 and 2002, and a short-term inhalation exposure study by the National Toxicology Program that was published in 2020. The 2001-2002 NIOSH studies involved injection of respirable dust from 10 abrasives with a saline solution directly into the lungs of groups of 6 rats for each abrasive. Saline solution with no dust was injected to a separate group of 6 rats as a negative control to represent unexposed rats. And silica sand was included in this study as a positive control because it had been shown to cause cell damage and fibrosis in rats in similar previous studies at these doses. So the study allowed a 4-week period of recovery after the installation of the dust, and then after which biochemical markers for inflammation and cell damage were measured, and the lungs were examined for fibrosis by pathologists. The blue bars in the graph are ratios of chemical markers for cell damage in exposed rats to the unexposed saline-only rats. The orange bars are the ratio of fibrosis score to the score for saline-only rats. And this plot shows that cell damage and fibrosis were evident at 4 weeks post-exposure. Ratios for the silica sand alternatives were similar to silica sand and even higher in several cases, which is what the authors concluded. The inhalation study by NTP in 2020 confirmed these results, and it was an inhalation study. It was a little different. It wasn't an installation injection study, but they confirmed these results for garnet, coal slag, and crushed glass. In this graph, the orange bars show a composite ratio of lung cell damage and fibrosis from the NIOSH installation studies, from highest to lowest, with the scale on the left axis. The blue bars show average beryllium content in each abrasive, in each class of abrasives, and this comes from a 1998 air monitoring study funded by NIOSH and conducted by KTA Tater that we will be discussing shortly. And the scale for the beryllium level is on the right axis. 8 of the 10 abrasive materials showed significant lung damage compared to unexposed controls, 6 of which had either very low or undetectable levels of beryllium in the 1998 KTA NIOSH study. Beryllium level was clearly not the driver of toxicity in these animal studies. And none of these effects were observed in 2 years of nearly constant exposure to high concentrations of respirable mineral dust containing on the order of 5 ppm beryllium. There is an extensive body of toxicological research on poorly soluble particles. And it shows that the primary driver of the chronic effects that lead to lung diseases and cancer is clearance. When particles are soluble or otherwise able to be cleared, there are generally no problems. The chronic effects that lead to disease and cancer happen when clearance is impaired, or the lung cells that defend us, which are called macrophage cells, are damaged. The particles remain in the lungs for extended periods of time. This is true for most, if not all, carcinogenic dusts. Particles have been observed in human lungs on autopsy, decades after exposure. So it's the biosolubility of mineral wool that makes all the difference. The reason it didn't cause disease in such a large number of toxicological studies is because our bodies are able to clear it, whether or not it contains trace levels of hazardous ingredients like beryllium. So now we want to talk about what we learned from a close look at air monitoring and air sampling and blasting. So this slide just provides an overview of what air monitoring is supposed to do. The purpose is to provide a measurement of the concentration of a substance in the air. The air concentration is the dose in lung toxicity and has units of mass per unit of volume of air, milligrams per meter cubed or micrograms per meter cubed. Now, in air sampling, a known amount of air, most often 2 liters a minute, is pulled through a filter cassette attached to a worker in their breathing zone or mounted elsewhere in the work environment. The filter traps dust entrained in that air that is pulled through the cassette by the pump. The dust on the filter is analyzed to measure the mass of the hazardous substance in the sample. And that mass is simply divided by the total volume of air pulled through the filter over the sampling time to arrive at a measured concentration. And these results are often adjusted to determine a time-weighted average over 8 hours. In a valid and accurate air sample, the sample mass should look like the graph on the right. That graph shows an example of sampling a fictitious environment with 10 milligrams per meter cubed dust concentration for 60 minutes. At zero pump flow, if the calibrated air pump is turned off, there should be close to zero dust on the filter because no air is being pulled through the cassette. When the pump is running and the sampling time is the same, the sample mass at 2 liters a minute should be roughly twice the sample mass at 1 liter a minute. That's the only way the sample mass at every flow rate would result in the same air concentration, which it should if it's accurately measuring the air concentration. Well, this relationship is not satisfied when sampling during blasting. Sample mass is highly variable, it's not repeatable, and there could be hundreds of milligrams of material or more on a sample even when the pump is turned off. There are 3 NIOSH studies over the past 30 years that concluded that air sampling during blasting results in overestimates of air concentrations. 2 of them were health hazard evaluations in the 1990s, and they're shown on this slide. But what they found is that when sampling during blasting, the air in particles are expelled from the nozzle at high speed. They impact the surface and then rebound in a high velocity turbulence. The rebounding particles and dust essentially fly into the sample cassette from their own inertia, whether the calibrated air pump is running or not. And some of this inertially driven particles are much larger than the inhalable particles between 0 and 100 microns that the cassettes are designed to collect, which further increases the sample mass. The end result is a substantial amount of sample that would not have otherwise been collected and has no correlation with the calibrated airflow. And this has the effect of artificially inflating the concentration measurements. In 2013, there's a study that was published in a peer-reviewed journal evaluating air sampling during blasting. NIOSH measured sample masses in active and passive samples side by side during the same sampling times. The active samples had the sample pump running, the passive samples did not. They observed that there was loose material along with material adhered to the filter after sampling, and they measured the masses separately. So this study supported the conclusions from the health hazard evaluations that were discussed on the previous slide and demonstrated some critically important problems. The sample masses were hundreds of times what they should be and highly variable from sample to sample. Most air monitoring methods stipulate a maximum sample mass of 2 milligrams on an individual sample. The loose material driven into the cassette from the high-speed air circulation represented between 92 and 100% of the sample mass. There's no correlation between the sampled air volume and sample mass, and 2 of the passive samples actually had higher sample mass than the active sample right next to it, and that's samples 1 and 7. These issues are specific to abrasive blasting, and they affect the entire industry. So now what we're going to do is go back and look at some prominent air monitoring studies and examine them for this effect to see if this effect was evident in those studies. And to do that, it is possible to, what happens in air monitoring, when you monitor for just dust, if you're trying to measure the dust in the air, you have to measure the weight of the cassette before you sample and after you sample to get the mass of dust on the filter. But total sample mass is almost never measured and recorded from air sampling for hazardous substances, which makes it difficult or impossible to assess whether these effects occurred. But it is possible to make a reasonable estimate of the total sample mass if the measured air concentration, the volume of air sampled, and the level of the hazardous substance in the abrasive are known. The mass of the contaminant on the sample is often directly reported. So you can often get the mass of the hazardous sample right off of the laboratory report. But once you have the mass of the contaminant on the sample, and you can divide by the fraction of the contaminant in the abrasive to give an estimate of how much total mass had to be on the sample to get that result. In other words, this assumes that all of the dust on the sample is abrasive dust, which is never strictly true. But it does allow for an order of magnitude or a better estimate. It'll tell you if the total sample mass was on the order of 1, 10, 100, or 1,000. Anything double digits or higher was probably inflated, and anything above 100 milligram would indicate a dramatically inflated sample. The 1998 NIOSH funded air monitoring study by KTA Tater has been cited as evidence that abrasive blasting is a source of beryllium exposure. It was an extensive study. It evaluated 40 abrasive products in 13 material categories and involved air sampling for total dust, in 40 air contaminants, one of which was beryllium. The study was set up like the diagram at the top. Air sampling was performed while blasting in a blast room, with ventilation air moving from one side to the other. For each abrasive, a personal breathing zone sample and 3 area samples inside the room were taken for each abrasive. Total dust concentrations were measured for each abrasive, but were not reported because of problems with sample overloading. Sample mass was not measured or reported in the samples for contaminants. The table on the right is a reproduction of the beryllium results from Appendix B of the study. The yellow highlighted cells in the virgin bulk sample are beryllium levels present in beryllium levels that represent materials for which beryllium wasn't detectable in the bulk sample at a reporting limit of 0.01 ppm. So it was less than 0.01 ppm in those samples. We left the 0.01 in there for calculation purposes. The gold highlighted cells in the area and breathing zone air sample results are results that were above the current beryllium action level. Those are the gold ones. And the red cells are above the current beryllium PEL. And what jumps out of this table is that all of the abrasive material types resulted in 1 or more air samples with beryllium above the action level in personal samples and area samples farther from the nozzle. 62.5% of the sample results were above the action level of all samples taken, and 47.5% were above the PEL. And many of these apparently high beryllium air concentrations were generated from abrasives with either extremely low or undetectable levels of beryllium in the abrasive. So this table takes a closer look at the data and provides estimates of sample mass and total dust concentration averaged over the products within each abrasive class. Every material class averaged above the beryllium action level, and 7 of the 10 averaged above the permissible exposure limit, regardless of the beryllium level in the abrasive. 5 of the 7 materials that averaged above the PEL had beryllium levels in the abrasive that were lower than 0.2 ppm. The only way that this could happen is if the sample masses were astronomically high. So we estimated the sample masses using the procedure described a couple slides ago. The estimated sample masses range from 62 to 1,712 milligrams in 24 minutes of blasting, of sampling, which means that the 2 milligram maximum that's specified in most air monitoring methods was being exceeded within each minute of sampling, sometimes within seconds. The estimated total dust concentrations in the samples range from around 1,300 to over 35,000 milligrams per meter cubed. I mean, the PEL for total dust is 15 milligrams per meter cubed. So it defies logic that these air concentrations were not inflated by inertially driven sample mass, as the NIOSH studies uncovered. None of this is intended as criticism of NIOSH or KTA Tater. Both are reputable, have long histories of doing excellent, scientifically sound work. They collected these samples using the procedures and methods that they're supposed to use, that are required to be used. If these were total dust samples, they would probably have been discounted because the sample mass is measured, and they would have known. And I think this is why they didn't report the results of sampling for total dust. the sample mass isn't considered in samples for hazardous contaminants. So there's no way to evaluate air sample results for validity and accuracy. This is the Meeker study. Pretty well-known study of abrasives, and this study is also cited as evidence that blasting causes exposure to dangerous levels of hazardous substances, including beryllium. And this is a 3-year study where air monitoring was performed using a different abrasive in each year. One was specular hematite, another was coal slag, and the third was steel grit. A primary difference between this study and the NIOSH KTA study is that total dust concentrations in this study were measured and reported. It's in the first row of table 3 on the right. They vary from 879 milligrams per meter cubed to nearly 10,000, which is consistent with the estimates of total dust that we made for the NIOSH KTA study on the previous slide. Despite undetectable beryllium levels in both the virgin bulk sample and the spent abrasive sample for specular hematite, the geometric mean beryllium concentration in the air was 0.5 micrograms per meter cubed. It's well above the PEL for beryllium. The estimated sample masses for specular hematite varied from 611 to 1,111 milligrams. And the sample masses for coal slag range from 275 to 813 milligrams. But probably most importantly, if you estimate sample mass using any of the results in this study for any metal where there were detectable levels of the metal in both the abrasive and in the air samples, the sample masses range from 80 milligrams on the low side to 1,622 on the high side. So this is not just a beryllium issue. The air concentrations of all hazardous substances appear to be dramatically inflated when they're measured in a blasting environment. So, to summarize what was presented here today, first, 10X material has been proven as well as it's possible to prove that it's neither hazardous nor classifiable as carcinogenic to humans. It has an IARC monograph supporting that conclusion. The accumulation of inertially driven material when air sampling in a blasting environment appears to be just a long known, but as of yet unaddressed problem. Look, we all share the common goal of creating work environments that are as safe as possible for workers. OSHA and other regulatory agencies set rules and standards to help achieve this, and many of those rules are based on the results of air sampling. When decisions are being made on an issue as critically important as safety, those air concentration measurements have to be accurate and represent the true exposure risk. They certainly can't overestimate exposures by a factor of 100 or 1,000. It exposes employers to unnecessary costs, and it has the unintended consequence of employers not being able to make properly informed decisions about the products they use and the safety of their employees. As I said at the beginning of this webinar, we're shining a light on these issues with the goal of starting a productive dialogue about how to address them, and we welcome additional discussions. So this pretty much concludes the presentation. Jake, I'll hand it back over to you.
Hey, I've been quiet. Thank you for introducing us, Stephanie, and Dr. Ritchie. That's a great presentation. A lot of information in there. We've got a few questions, and we don't have a lot of time to answer everyone on this webinar. It is, I think it's restricted to an hour. So what we're going to do is answer the question that we see the most, and directly on here in the few minutes we have left. And then what we'll do after the webinar is reach out directly to everyone else who's asked other questions that aren't covered by this one that covers a few of the questions asked. And we'll do that very quickly. We have a report that tells us your contact information and the questions that you asked. So we will be in touch with you directly promptly. So the overarching question is, Steve, essentially, folks see that there's a lot of evidence that our product is safe and that mineral wool, even in the fibrous format, is safe, even in inhalation. However, we have the beryllium rule, at least in the United States. How are we going to comply with that? What's the path forward, regardless of the abrasive in use or with 10X? What is the path forward to be compliant at this time?
Well, we all absolutely have to comply with the beryllium rule. The revised beryllium rule, it's generally written to apply to materials that contain more than 0.1%, which is 1,000 ppm of beryllium. But if you're using a material that contains less than 1,000 ppm, the beryllium air concentration measured in the personal breathing zone of workers has to be below the action level as an 8-hour time-weighted average. And this is under any foreseeable conditions. Employers can also, there is an option to use objective data to show that the action level is unlikely to be exceeded given the beryllium level in the material and the expected dust concentrations in the work environment. Every abrasive discussed today, including 10X, could provide objective data that beryllium air concentrations would not be expected to exceed the action level as long as total dust is kept below the PEL for total dust of 15 milligrams per meter cubed. We've also shown that every abrasive runs the risk of exceeding the action level from air concentration measurements, no matter how low the beryllium level is in the material, because of the inflation of sample mass from inertially driven particles. I mean, this is the problem we're trying to shine a light on. The beryllium rule and many other rules for hazardous substances depend on accurate air concentration measurements. The provisions of these rules can be unnecessarily triggered by air concentration measurements that are orders of magnitude higher than what the employee is actually exposed to. And it's not being recognized. It's happened with beryllium using our material, and we're aware of air monitoring results in the field that have been above the action level in PEL when using other abrasives that have even lower beryllium content. So this is just so important for everybody in this industry because it could lead to bad decisions for our workers.
Thank you, Steve, for answering that, and just want to thank Steve Idris, also our CEO, for being on here, and thank you to the folks at AMP and Coatings Pro for hosting this and helping us get this important information out. We really appreciate it, and with that, we'll give back the time. We're going to end just a little bit early, but Stephanie, if you want to take it away. And hope to see everybody soon.
Thank you. Thanks to Dr. Stephen Ritchie, Jacob Valancourt, and Steve Idris for sharing some of their time and knowledge with our attendees. Thank you to everyone else for joining us in today's webcast called Blasting Safety with 10X Abrasives. As a reminder, the webcast will be available on demand in about 24 hours and will be accessible then. As always, happy coding!